Edwin Arlington Robinson was a famous American poet that lived from 1869 to 1935. The really cool thing about Edwin Arlington Robinson is that I think, like many other artists, his life events and the things that happened in his life really made him turn to poetry for art. So as I was looking through him as an artist and as a poetess and as someone who just has been through a lot, I really started to appreciate his work more than I had thought before. So he was born in Alna, Maine, which is an extremely small town. And it's very interesting because his family was actually very wealthy, and he had the intentions to go into business, but actually didn't, simply because he knew from such a young age that he was going to be a writer or he was going to do something like that. So understanding just that first basic introduction to Edwin Arlington Robinson, you can see where there were times in his life that there were already hindrances towards his artistic ability with writing, but that didn't stop him in the long run. I think it's also important to mention here that through Edwin's kind of life, he went through a lot as a child and then into adulthood. His name, actually, they thought that it was going to be a girl, ended up being a boy, and his name came from some lottery thing, and they just thought, oh, Edwin, that sounds cool, and called him Win the rest of his life. But actually, on the opposite side of that, he almost didn't seem like a winner, simply because he was more of a writer than he was a businessman like the rest of his family. The rest of his family was very athletic, very outgoing, and he was kind of the black sheep that stood out, and he just wanted to write. He didn't want to go into business like his father or his brothers. He simply wanted to write. He wasn't athletic. He just kind of wanted to do his own thing. And I think simply being the black sheep alone really adds to how his art came to play. The way he writes, I think, comes from a place of life events and also just from his personality type. When he was very young, he quoted that at the age of 12, he knew that he was doomed for poetry and that he wouldn't be able to escape that. And luckily, he didn't. He stuck with it, and he ended up being one of the most famous American poets, really one of the most famous poets ever. And so it's very interesting to look at his youth, was schooling with Harvard, and although he was shy and reserved, it almost kind of played a part for him to become this great poet. And I think that's really interesting to look at. And even though he went through a lot in his youth and adulthood, just with family issues like everyone has, I think it was a beautiful thing that he was able to take it and turn it into beautiful poetry. I think it's also when you look deeply at Edwin's life, you can see that there was that standard set for him going into the business, and like I mentioned in the previous slide, he was meant for business, and his family was very financially wealthy, but he didn't want to do that. He was the black sheep. So he went on to do his own schooling for writing with Harvard College, but then later on in life, I think it was around his youthfulness, but his family had a huge financial loss in 1893, which was a big deal because they were so wealthy, and that was kind of what their family was built upon. And then not too long after that, his father died shortly after the financial loss, and then his mother died in 1896, and then his brother died in 1899 from a drug overdose. So you can kind of see where his life took a huge crumble in just under 7 or 8 years, and I think that really inspired his poetry. Somewhere after the time that his brother died, and a lot of his family died, he somehow created a relationship and a friendship with Laura E. Richards, which was a very famous writer and gardener. She was a crucial person to his life. It's been stated that they wrote each other every single week for the rest of his life until he died on April 6th, in 1935 from cancer. And so I think it's interesting to mentioned that that friendship alone took him places more than him going to school, more than him discovering his talent. It was also said that he had a lot of suicidal thoughts. We don't know when exactly this was, but we do know that his friendship with Laura E. Richards was crucial to him becoming a better writer, and she was there to honestly walk him off the ledge in his own mind from these suicidal thoughts. And then with that connection with Laura E. Richards, he got the connection to his literary mentor, John Hayes Gardenier, who was also someone from Harvard who he just really dug into. And so I think it really speaks volumes to how having the right people around you can really take you places. He ended up writing about 28 books of poetry, a lot of famous works, and ended up winning the Pulitzer Prize 3 times within a very short amount of time. Won in 1922, 1925, and 1928. So I think it's important to highlight these life events, and I wouldn't even say that they would be life events, but I think they would be like these necessary things in his life where he found that it was important for him to have the right people in his life, and they really took him a long ways in the long run. Last but not least, looking at Edwin Arlington Robinson's works of art, I think it's really interesting because he wrote a lot of poetry, 28 books of poetry, and books means a lot of pages, but he actually wrote multiple poems within that. He started initially copying and mailing off The Torrent and The Night Before to try to get people to read it, and that was his first initial famous work. But some of the biggest things that he is most known for is his Tilbury Town collection of poetry, and obviously Richard Cory. I think when we look at these poems, I've read Richard Cory and a couple from Tilbury Town, you see it's not that they reflect his life, but they have been inspired from his life. For example, Richard Cory is about a man who was wealthy and everyone wants to be like him, but he ends up committing suicide. I think that kind of comes from the fact that his family was so caught up in financial stability and financial abundance, and maybe even the connection between his brother having a drug overdose later, even though his brother went into business. I think it's really interesting to look at all of his famous works and look at his life, and we're actually able to magnify his life through his poetry now that we can understand his life in general. And so overall, his life was maybe not the most exciting thing ever, but I think he turned it into just a beautiful work of art simply because he decided to have the right people around him, and he took his time to make poetry for things that were really awesome in his life and the things that were really sad in his life. And I think if you can make something beautiful out of something that's not beautiful, it's really a talent to have that and to be able to make it into a nice work of art as poetry.